Earl Martin adjusted the collar of his worn-out coat and tugged his cap a bit lower over his forehead. He looked at his reflection in the tinted glass of the exclusive restaurant he was about to enter, chuckling quietly to himself. In his faded jeans, old sneakers, and a coat that had seen better days, he looked far from the billionaire he was. Today, Earl wanted to blend in, or rather, stand out in a way that would make him invisible to those who cared only for the rich and the polished. He had spent his life building an empire from the ground up, but he hadn't forgotten the feeling of being dismissed, ignored, or, worse, looked down upon. He was here to see if that reality still held true in places like this, where status was prized above character. The restaurant La Maison was renowned not just for its exquisite French cuisine, but for its exclusivity. The people who dined there were usually dressed in designer suits or evening gowns, their wealth and prestige announced with every glance and gesture. Earl took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he half expected, disdain from those who couldn't see beyond the surface. As he stepped inside, the smell of freshly baked bread and rich, buttery sauces wafted through the air, mingling with the clinking of fine china and the low murmur of hushed conversations. Earl could feel the eyes on him almost immediately. Patrons cast him quick glances, dismissing him in seconds, but he was more interested in the staff's reactions. The hostess, a young woman with perfect makeup and an icy stare, looked him up and down, her expression shifting from polite neutrality to thinly veiled contempt. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice so clipped it was nearly a whisper. Earl noted the way her gaze flicked to his worn coat, then back to his face with a trace of skepticism. "Yes," Earl replied warmly. "I'd like a table, please." The hostess's smile was barely there, as if plastered on out of obligation. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight," she said, her tone making it clear that she didn't believe he belonged there. Earl glanced around the room, noting the empty tables scattered here and there. It was an excuse he recognized, a polite way to deny service without outright saying it. "I don't mind waiting," he replied. "I'll just take a seat and wait until something opens up." Earl's voice was gentle, kind, but his eyes held a subtle challenge. He wanted to see how far she'd go. The hostess's forced smile faded as she shifted her weight, clearly irritated. "Sir, we don't have a waiting area," she said, looking pointedly at the door as if encouraging him to leave. Earl simply stood there, hands in his pockets, calm and unruffled. The hostess's discomfort grew, and she glanced over her shoulder to a waiter standing nearby, hoping for support. The waiter sauntered over, a tall young man with a look of condescension that matched the hostess's. He was dressed immaculately, his uniform crisp and spotless. He looked Earl up and down with an expression of thinly veiled disdain. "Is there a problem here, Claire?" he asked, turning his attention to the hostess, but loud enough that anyone nearby could hear. "This gentleman is looking for a table," the hostess said, clearly hoping the waiter would handle the situation. Earl could almost feel the weight of their judgment, as if his appearance alone had violated the sanctity of their refined establishment. "Sir," the waiter said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "this is an exclusive restaurant. We're fully booked." He looked down at Earl's clothes, letting his gaze linger on the frayed edges of the old coat, his lips curling into a smirk. Earl raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in his eyes, but he kept his voice steady. "I understand that," he said patiently, "but I'd still like to wait. I'll be no trouble, I assure you." He made to step forward, but the waiter stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Look," the waiter said, lowering his voice but not his hostility. "I don't think you'll find what you're looking for here. Maybe try down the street." Earl caught the faint hint of a sneer, as if he were some vagabond begging for scraps. It was a look he hadn't seen in years but remembered all too well from his youth. Earl let the silence stretch, studying the young man's face. "And what exactly is it you think I'm looking for?" he asked quietly, challenging the waiter to voice his prejudice. The waiter faltered for a moment, unprepared for the question, but quickly recovered. "This isn't the kind of place where, well, it's just not for everyone." He said it with a shrug, dismissive, as if the meaning was obvious. Earl held back a smile, the irony too rich for him to ignore. Here was a young man, practically a boy by his standards, judging him on appearances alone, unaware of the fortune hidden beneath the threadbare coat. The exchange caught the attention of the restaurant manager, a tall, middle-aged man with a sharp suit and an air of superiority. Sensing the potential for a scene, he approached, his expression one of forced politeness. "Is there a problem here, sir?" he asked, his gaze just as critical as the others. Earl straightened, meeting the manager's eyes with a steady, calm expression. "No problem at all. I was simply hoping to enjoy a meal here, but it seems that my presence is unwelcome." The manager's face hardened, the mask of politeness dropping slightly. "This is a fine dining establishment, sir," he said, enunciating each word as if Earl might not understand them. "We have a reputation to uphold, and we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who does not meet our standards." Earl's gaze didn't waver. And what standards would those be? The manager shifted uncomfortably, clearly irritated by the persistence. "We cater to a certain clientele, if you understand my meaning." "Oh, I understand," Earl replied, his voice smooth but carrying a faint edge. "It's just a shame that your standards seem to be based more on appearances than on character." He let the words hang in the air, watching the manager's expression shift from arrogance to thinly veiled annoyance. The manager took a step closer, lowering his voice to a menacing tone. "Sir, I suggest you leave before we have to ask security to escort you out." Earl raised his hands in a mock gesture of surrender, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "No need for that. I wouldn't want to cause any trouble." He turned, casting one last glance around the room, taking in the faces of the patrons who had watched the exchange with indifference or mild curiosity. As he walked toward the door, he could feel their judgmental gazes on his back. But he smiled to himself, knowing they had no idea who he really was. Outside, Earl paused, the cool night air brushing against his face as he took a deep breath. Part of him was amused by the absurdity of it all, but a larger part was disappointed. Even after all these years, the prejudice and superficiality he'd faced in his youth still lingered in places like this, hidden behind polished walls and designer suits. It was a reminder of why he'd worked so hard, why he'd built his fortune in a way that gave people opportunities based on their merit, not their appearance. But Earl Martin wasn't a man who let things slide. He'd built an empire through persistence, grit, and a refusal to accept injustice. This wasn't just about a meal denied, it was about a culture that dismissed people based on nothing more than the surface. And if there was one thing he was certain of, it was that he had the means to make a change. As he walked away from the restaurant, his mind was already churning with ideas. He knew exactly what he was going to do next. Earl returned to his penthouse suite, the distant hum of the city below filling the silence as he looked out over the skyline. In his long life he had encountered countless people like the staff at La Maison, people who judged others by the cut of their coat, the watch on their wrist, or the car they drove. It was an ugliness he had learned to rise above, but tonight, that familiar bitterness simmered under the surface. Earl felt the weight of the slight in a way he hadn't expected. It stirred old memories of times when he was young, struggling, and often dismissed. It was a time he thought he had left behind, yet here it was, staring him in the face again. Only this time he had the power to do something about it. He sank into his leather armchair and reached for his phone. In his contacts were the names of some of the most powerful people in the business world, people he had earned the respect of not through appearances, but through resilience and results. A few phone calls later, Earl had all the information he needed. La Maison wasn't a small, family-owned restaurant. It was part of a larger hospitality group that managed high-end dining establishments across the city. The group prided itself on exclusivity, catering to the wealthy elite with an image of refinement that was as shallow as the staff it employed. Over the next few days, Earl worked quietly, setting up meetings, signing documents, and positioning his assets in a way that would allow him to make his move with minimal fanfare. He didn't want this to be a spectacle, he wanted it to be a lesson. By the end of the week, he had acquired a controlling interest in the hospitality group that owned La Maison. The takeover was swift, and thanks to his considerable network, it went through without resistance. Most people in the company were unaware of the change, and that was exactly how Earl wanted it. His plan wasn't to dismantle the business, but to reshape it from within. When he finally walked back through the doors of La Maison, it was on his terms. Dressed in a tailored suit, he looked every bit the powerful businessman he was, but his approach was quiet, almost unassuming. The same hostess from his first visit was there, and though she recognized him, her reaction was different this time. She greeted him with a polished smile, clearly trying to make up for the previous encounter. But Earl wasn't there to take a seat and dine, he was there to observe, to see if the staff's attitudes would change even slightly now that they knew he was someone of importance. As he took a quiet seat near the back, Earl watched the flow of the restaurant, noting how the staff interacted with each table. For the wealthy patrons in designer clothes, the service was attentive, bordering on fawning. But when a young couple dressed in modest attire came in, they were met with the same thinly veiled disdain he had experienced. The waiter assigned to them, the same one who had insulted him, gave them cursory service, his eyes darting around to more important tables while barely acknowledging the couple's presence. Earl noted every instance of disrespect, every slight that confirmed the toxic culture he had suspected. After an hour of watching this subtle hierarchy play out, he decided it was time to introduce himself properly. He signaled the manager, who was also the same man from his last visit, and requested a private meeting. The manager, sensing something important, ushered him into the restaurant's small, upscale back office, a room lined with bottles of expensive wine and polished mahogany furniture. He looked at Earl with a mixture of curiosity and respect, unaware of the shift in their dynamic. "Mr. Martin," the manager began, "it's an honor to have you here. I understand you've recently taken an interest in our establishment." Earl nodded, a calm smile playing on his lips. "Yes, that's one way to put it. I wanted to see how the place operates firsthand." The manager's face tightened, a hint of uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Of course. I hope everything has been to your satisfaction." Earl leaned forward, his gaze steady. "That depends on how you define satisfaction. If you mean the quality of the food, yes, it's excellent. But if you're asking about how your staff treats people well, that's another story." The manager cleared his throat, clearly caught off guard. I'm not sure I understand, sir." Earl's voice softened, but his words cut sharply. "I came here last week, dressed in less than ideal attire, hoping to be treated like any other customer. Instead, I was insulted, dismissed, and ultimately thrown out. Tonight, I've watched your staff treat patrons according to their perceived wealth and status rather than with basic respect." The manager's face paled, but he tried to mask his discomfort with a tight smile. "Mr. Martin, I apologize if you had an unpleasant experience. I assure you, our staff is trained to maintain a high level of professionalism." Earl's eyes narrowed. "Professionalism isn't what I saw. I saw arrogance, condescension, and a lack of basic decency. And I'm not here to apologize or to accept one. I'm here to make some changes." The manager's face tightened further as he tried to maintain his composure. "Of course, sir. We're always open to feedback and improvements. What did you have in mind?" Earl leaned back, letting a moment of silence pass before he spoke. "From now on, everyone who walks through those doors will be treated with respect, regardless of how they're dressed, what they look like, or how much you think they're worth. I want this place to be known for its service, not its exclusivity, and any staff member who can't deliver on that will be replaced." "Understood." The manager swallowed hard, clearly unnerved by the gravity in Earl's tone. "Understood, sir." Over the next few days, Earl implemented new policies and hired a team to train the staff in respectful and inclusive customer service. He didn't just want to change the culture of La Maison, he wanted to set a new standard for every establishment under the hospitality group. He quietly observed as the transformation began, noting the subtle resistance from some of the more entitled staff members, including the waiter and hostess who had disrespected him on his first visit. They sneered when they thought no one was watching, muttering about the ridiculous new policies and how catering to all sorts would ruin the restaurant's reputation. Earl knew that these were the ones who would need to go, but he was patient. He wanted to give them a chance to adapt, to see if they could grow. He'd been given chances in his own life when people believed in his potential, and he wanted to extend that same opportunity here. But he also had his limits, and he wouldn't hesitate to make an example of those who continued to resist. One evening, Earl conducted an unannounced inspection, observing the restaurant's busiest hours. He watched as a family of 4, modestly dressed and with young children, came in, looking a little out of place but hopeful. The hostess, still resentful of the new policies, rolled her eyes and led them to a less desirable table near the back. Earl's patience snapped. He quietly approached the manager, who had been following his instructions diligently, and pointed out the incident. "Let her know her services are no longer needed," Earl said quietly. The manager nodded, understanding immediately. The hostess was dismissed that night, and the story of her termination spread quickly through the staff. It served as a clear warning. Earl was serious about his mission to change the restaurant's culture. Bit by bit, the resistance waned, and the staff began to embrace the new approach. Earl implemented a reward system for employees who demonstrated exceptional service, fostering a sense of pride and unity among those who remained. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere in La Maison shifted. Customers noticed the difference, and word of mouth spread about the new, welcoming spirit of the restaurant. Families, young couples, and even tourists began to dine there, mingling with the wealthy elite in a space where everyone was treated with warmth and respect. Earl watched his vision take shape, feeling a sense of satisfaction he hadn't anticipated. One evening, as the restaurant bustled with a diverse crowd of patrons, Earl took a seat at a quiet corner table. He looked around, seeing the transformation he had brought to life. A place where no one was turned away or dismissed for how they looked. He knew his work wasn't done. There were still hurdles to overcome, and he still had to address the underlying prejudice in some of the other establishments within the group. But for now he felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing he had made a lasting impact on La Maison and set the stage for what was to come. Earl's transformation of La Maison was underway, but as he delved deeper into the operations of the restaurant and its parent company, he encountered resistance from higher up. The pushback didn't surprise him. Many within the group had built their careers on the restaurant's exclusive, elite image, and they were deeply invested in maintaining that aura. The head chef, in particular, had a reputation as a culinary artist who catered only to the crème de la crème, viewing himself as a gatekeeper of luxury dining. For years he had ensured that La Maison served a particular type of customer, those whose presence boosted the restaurant's prestige and appeal. When the head chef heard of Earl's policy changes, he saw them as an affront to his work, a dilution of his carefully curated brand. He argued that opening the restaurant's doors to just anyone would tarnish its name, warning Earl that the new direction would drive away their affluent clientele. Earl listened to the chef's concerns with patience, recognizing the man's pride in his craft. But Earl remained resolute, reminding the chef that his talents were just as valuable to someone of modest means as to a billionaire. "It's not about lowering standards," Earl explained, "but raising them where they matter. We can deliver exceptional service without turning people away based on how they look. Real luxury, real value, comes from being inclusive." The chef, however, was unmoved. He remained openly defiant, refusing to adapt his attitude toward customers and maintaining his narrow approach to service. Earl understood that the chef's ego was tied to the exclusivity that he believed justified his artistry. But he also recognized that allowing such defiance to fester could sabotage his vision. The more Earl observed, the clearer it became that the head chef's influence was a hindrance. Yet Earl decided to give him time, hoping he would eventually see the benefit of the new approach. Meanwhile, some of the waitstaff, spurred on by the chef's attitude, began to act out in subtle ways. They followed Earl's rules on the surface but made snide comments behind closed doors, questioning his authority and resenting what they saw as a watering down of the restaurant's image. Earl was aware of these rumblings. He knew some employees saw him as an eccentric billionaire meddling in affairs he didn't understand. But Earl had spent years dealing with people who underestimated him. He'd built an empire despite being dismissed, and he wasn't about to back down now. Earl continued his quiet observation, noting the behavior of each employee, especially during busy hours when their attitude showed most. One night he noticed a couple enter the restaurant, dressed in modest attire but radiating excitement. It was clear they were celebrating something special. The woman wore a simple dress, her hand resting protectively over her slightly rounded belly, while her partner held her arm with a tenderness that caught Earl's attention. As they waited at the front, Earl saw the waiter who had initially mocked him glance in their direction, his lip curling into a sneer. Earl's patience thinned as he watched the waiter lead them to the least desirable table, a small spot near the kitchen door. The couple, while visibly uncomfortable, did their best to settle in, grateful just to be there. Earl knew this was a defining moment. He could no longer allow such behavior to go unchecked. Rising from his own seat, he approached the table and greeted the couple warmly, startling the waiter, who stumbled over his words in surprise. "Good evening," Earl said to the couple, his voice gentle. "I'm Earl Martin, the owner of La Maison. I'd like to personally thank you for choosing to dine with us tonight. If you don't mind, I'd love to offer you a table with a bit more ambience." The couple exchanged glances, their faces lighting up with gratitude and relief. The waiter's expression soured as Earl gestured toward one of the restaurant's prime tables, set by a window with a view of the city lights. Earl watched the couple settle into their new table, noting the joy on their faces, and made a mental note to have a serious conversation with the waiter about his behavior. The following day, Earl called a staff meeting. The room was tense as employees shuffled in, many of them unsure of what to expect. Earl could feel the underlying resistance simmering in the air, but he addressed the group with calm authority. "I know that some of you are struggling with the changes we've made," he began, looking directly at the head chef and the few waitstaff who had been the most vocal in their opposition. "But let me be clear, this restaurant, and every establishment under this group, is about to undergo a transformation. Our success will not be built on exclusion or elitism. Our legacy will be one of respect, warmth, and quality for every customer." He paused, letting his words sink in, before continuing. "If you cannot embrace this change, if you are unwilling to treat every person who walks through those doors with the dignity they deserve, then perhaps this is not the place for you." The head chef's face was a mask of defiance, His arms crossed as he stared at Earl without a trace of remorse. Earl expected as much. The chef had built his reputation on the exclusivity of his craft, and to him, the idea of serving ordinary people was beneath his standards. But Earl was unfazed. He turned his attention to the rest of the staff, noting the nervous glances exchanged among them. "This is your chance to be part of something meaningful," Earl continued, his gaze steady. "To create an environment where people feel welcomed, respected, and valued. And if that doesn't align with your vision, then it's time to part ways." The silence that followed was heavy, but Earl knew he had made his stance clear. Over the next few days, the head chef's resentment grew, and his behavior became increasingly disruptive. He refused to comply with Earl's requests, deliberately altering dishes to be less palatable for patrons he deemed undesirable. Earl's patience had reached its limit, and after one particularly blatant act of defiance, he called the chef into his office. "Consider this your last day at La Maison," Earl said, his tone calm but firm. "I had hoped you would see the potential for growth here, but it's clear that you're unwilling to change." The chef's face turned red with indignation, but he held his tongue, knowing he had pushed too far. As he walked out of the restaurant for the last time, Earl felt a mixture of disappointment and relief. It was never easy to let go of talented people, but he was determined to uphold the values he believed in. With the chef gone, Earl promoted one of the sous chefs, a young woman who had embraced his vision with enthusiasm. She was talented, humble, and passionate about the restaurant's new direction, and under her leadership, the kitchen became a place of cooperation and creativity. The staff, seeing the changes unfold, began to adapt, and Earl's vision slowly became a reality. Weeks later, La Maison was a transformed establishment. The atmosphere had shifted from one of cold exclusivity to warm elegance, where every guest felt genuinely welcome. Customers noticed the change, and the restaurant began attracting a broader clientele, including families, young couples, and even individuals who had never dined in such a high-end setting before. Word of mouth spread, and soon, La Maison became known not just for its food, but for its inclusive spirit. One evening, as the restaurant buzzed with energy, Earl took a seat in his usual quiet corner, watching the diverse crowd enjoying their meals. He saw a family with young children, a group of college students celebrating a birthday, and an elderly couple holding hands over a candlelit dinner. The scene filled him with a deep sense of fulfillment. He had created a place where everyone could feel special, where kindness and respect were served alongside the food. Just as he was about to leave, the manager approached him, a smile on his face. "Mr. Martin, I have to say, I was skeptical at first. But seeing how happy people are, I think you were right." Earl smiled, placing a reassuring hand on the manager's shoulder. Sometimes all it takes is a shift in perspective. People just want to be seen, to be valued. And when we give them that, it changes everything. As Earl walked out of La Maison that night, he felt a sense of peace. He knew there were still challenges ahead, that other restaurants in the group would require the same transformation. But he was ready, and he was more determined than ever. This wasn't just about one restaurant, it was about setting a new standard, one that would ripple through the entire industry. Earl had started with a vision of respect, and he had brought it to life in a way that felt as powerful as any of his past achievements. With each step he took into the night, he knew he was leaving behind more than just a successful restaurant. He was leaving a legacy of dignity, one that would echo long after he was gone. Earl's new vision for La Maison was firmly taking root, but as he expanded his efforts across the parent hospitality group, he encountered an even stronger wave of resistance. The group's upper management, primarily people who had been with the company since its founding, saw his inclusivity policy as a direct threat to the brand's prestige. They were deeply attached to the image of luxury and exclusivity that the brand had cultivated over the years, an image they believed justified the higher prices and maintained their elite clientele. For them, Earl's changes were not just disruptive, they were sacrilegious. The CEO of the group, Richard Wallace, was one of the most vocal opponents. A tall, silver-haired man with a reputation for ruthlessly guarding the company's image, Richard had grown the business from a single, high-end restaurant into a chain synonymous with wealth and privilege. To him, Earl's approach was an assault on the very foundation he had built. Earl was summoned to an executive meeting, where Richard and several other senior managers were prepared to confront him directly. The meeting took place in a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline. The executives sat around the table, their expressions a mix of skepticism and frustration. Earl remained calm, his gaze steady as he faced Richard across the table. "Earl," Richard began, his voice measured but with a sharp edge, "we understand that you have a certain philosophy about how things should run. but I'm afraid it's just not compatible with our brand. Our customers expect a certain standard, a level of exclusivity that justifies our reputation. Catering to everyone well, it's simply not what we do. Earl leaned forward, meeting Richard's gaze without a hint of intimidation. I understand that exclusivity has been a part of the brand's identity, but I believe true luxury isn't about exclusion. It's about making people feel valued, regardless of their background. Richard's eyes narrowed, a glint of irritation flashing in them. With all due respect, Earl, our clientele is not interested in mingling with just anyone. People come here to be part of an experience that isn't accessible to everyone. By trying to democratize that experience, you're undermining the very thing that makes us special. Earl kept his voice steady, unshaken by the undercurrent of hostility. I'm not asking for us to lower our standards. I'm asking for us to raise them where it counts. Treating people with respect doesn't diminish the experience, it enhances it. And if we're truly offering something of value, we shouldn't need to rely on superficial barriers to create appeal. Another executive, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an air of impatience, leaned forward, her voice dripping with sarcasm. And what's next, Earl? Do we start letting anyone in off the street? Do we offer discounts to the masses? Our customers come here because they know they're entering an exclusive world. You're taking that away from them. Earl's patience was wearing thin, but he remained composed. Perhaps it's time to redefine what exclusivity means. The world is changing, and people want authenticity, not arrogance. We have an opportunity to lead, to show that true luxury is about the quality of our service and the warmth of our welcome. Richard sighed, his face a mask of frustration. With all due respect, Earl, this isn't a charity. This is a business. Our shareholders expect results, not social experiments. Earl's gaze hardened. Then, let's talk results. Since implementing these changes at La Maison, we've seen an increase in reservations, and our customer satisfaction scores are higher than they've been in years. People are talking about us not because we're exclusive, but because we're welcoming. That's what's driving growth. Richard looked away, clearly unwilling to concede, but the other executives shifted uncomfortably. Earl had brought facts to the table, and his argument was hard to dismiss. Richard, however, wasn't ready to give in. Fine, he said with a tight smile. If you're so confident in this approach, then prove it. But I'll be watching closely. If I see even a hint that these changes are damaging our brand, I'll have no choice but to reverse them. We built this company on a promise of exclusivity, and I won't let that be tarnished. Earl simply nodded, unperturbed. That's fair. I'm confident the results will speak for themselves. As the meeting adjourned, Earl felt a surge of determination. He knew that he was up against decades of ingrained attitudes, but he also believed in his vision. Richard and the other executives might see his approach as a threat, but Earl saw it as an evolution, a chance to create something lasting and meaningful. Over the next several weeks, Earl expanded his changes to more of the company's restaurants. He introduced customer service training focused on respect and empathy, instilling in staff the idea that every guest, regardless of appearance, deserved the highest level of service. The initial resistance among employees was palpable, but as Earl spent time in each restaurant, leading by example, he began to win people over. Some staff members, like the new head chef at La Maison, embraced the changes wholeheartedly, while others adapted gradually, realizing that treating guests well actually made their work more enjoyable and fulfilling. However, pockets of resistance still remained. A handful of employees continued to cling to the old ways, subtly undermining Earl's efforts whenever they could. They saw his vision as an unwelcome imposition, a disruption of the familiar hierarchy that had allowed them to feel superior to certain guests. These employees would feign compliance when Earl was present, only to revert to their dismissive behavior once he left. Earl was aware of these attitudes, but he was prepared to let the results reveal who was truly committed to the new direction. In one particular restaurant, a senior manager named Colin had become a thorn in Earl's side. Colin was well liked among his staff, but his loyalty to the old ways ran deep. He openly questioned Earl's policies, undermining them in subtle ways and encouraging his team to resist the changes. Earl knew that if he wanted to succeed, he would have to address this issue directly. One evening, Earl visited Colin's restaurant unannounced. He watched from a quiet corner as Colin interacted with the staff and customers. Noting the subtle ways he bent the rules to maintain the old exclusivity. Earl saw him direct a well-dressed patron to a prime table while seating a young couple near the entrance, away from the main dining area. Earl's frustration mounted, but he kept his composure. After observing for some time, Earl approached Colin privately, requesting a conversation in his office. Colin's face registered surprise, but he led Earl to the office, where he sat across from him with a defiant look in his eyes. Colin, Earl began, his tone calm but firm. I've noticed that you're still following the old practices, even though we've implemented new policies. I need to know if you're committed to the vision we're building here. Colin crossed his arms, a hint of a smirk on his face. With all due respect, Mr. Martin, I've been running this place successfully for years. I know our customers and they expect a certain level of exclusivity. These changes, they don't make sense for us. Earl leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. I understand that you're used to a certain approach, but we're creating something bigger than that. We're setting a new standard, one that values every customer. If you can't support that, then perhaps this isn't the right place for you anymore. Colin's smirk faded as he realized the seriousness of Earl's words. He hesitated, then spoke, his voice defensive. I just don't see how catering to everyone will help us. Our reputation has been built on being selective. Earl's voice softened, but his resolve was clear. I believe that our reputation can be built on something better, something lasting. People remember how they're treated, Colin. They remember kindness, respect. That's what will set us apart. Colin fell silent, his expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. Earl gave him a final look, a silent understanding passing between them. Colin knew that his days of ignoring the new policies were over. Whether he stayed or left was now up to him. Earl left the restaurant that evening, feeling a sense of relief. He knew there would still be challenges, that not everyone would embrace his vision willingly, but he was willing to make difficult choices to uphold the principles he believed in. As he continued to visit each restaurant, overseeing the gradual transformation, he felt a growing sense of accomplishment. The feedback from customers was overwhelmingly positive, and the restaurants were thriving, drawing in a more diverse crowd than ever before. By the time Earl had completed his rounds, he could see the impact of his efforts. The hospitality group was evolving, becoming known not just for its fine dining but for its welcoming atmosphere, where every guest felt valued. Earl's vision had taken hold, and though there were still those who resisted, the momentum was undeniable. Richard Wallace and the other executives watched the results closely, unable to ignore the success Earl's approach had brought. Reluctantly, they began to accept that perhaps he had been right all along. Earl knew he had won their begrudging respect, but for him, it wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about creating a legacy of dignity and respect, one that would endure long after he was gone. As he looked toward the future, Earl felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had not only changed a company, he had set a new standard in an industry that sorely needed it. And with each step he took, he knew he was leaving a lasting impact, one built not on wealth or exclusivity, but on the power of respect and the strength of integrity. Earl stood in the doorway of La Maison one evening, watching the bustling scene within. It was a Friday night, and the restaurant was filled to capacity, the low hum of conversation and laughter mingling with the clinking of glasses and the soothing strains of a jazz quartet playing softly in the background. The warm lighting cast a gentle glow over the patrons, and the elegant decor exuded sophistication without a hint of pretension. Earl smiled, a deep satisfaction settling over him, as he observed the diverse clientele, families, couples, solo diners all enjoying the atmosphere he had worked so hard to cultivate. In a corner booth, a young couple toasted over their meal, their hands intertwined as they leaned close, their eyes alight with affection. At a nearby table, a mother laughed as her young son tried to sneak a taste of her dessert, his face lighting up with delight as she playfully nudged him away. Earl's gaze lingered on each guest, appreciating the unique stories and backgrounds that each person brought to the experience. This was the essence of La Maison, as he had envisioned it, a place where anyone, regardless of background, could feel special. Earl's attention shifted to the staff as they moved through the dining room with a newfound grace and attentiveness. The once stubborn waiter, who had initially balked at the changes, was now smiling warmly as he served a table of middle-aged friends celebrating a birthday. His transformation had been gradual but genuine, and Earl was proud to see him thriving in this new, inclusive environment. The hostess, who had once treated Earl with disdain, was now greeting guests with kindness, her demeanor softened and welcoming. Earl made his way through the dining room, quietly observing the interactions, feeling a sense of pride in the transformation that had taken place. When he reached the kitchen, he was greeted by the familiar clamor of pots and pans, the sizzling of sauces, and the aroma of carefully prepared dishes. The new head chef, a young woman with a passion for creativity and inclusivity, was at the helm, orchestrating the kitchen staff with confidence and precision. She caught sight of Earl and offered him a smile before returning to her work, focused and determined. "Chef," Earl called to her as she plated a dish, her hands moving swiftly and expertly. She looked up, her face flushed with the energy of the kitchen. "Yes, Mr. Martin?" "I just wanted to say how proud I am of the work you and your team are doing," he said, his voice sincere. "You've brought so much heart and soul into this place. It shows." The chef's smile widened. "Thank you, Mr. Martin. It's been an honor to bring your vision to life. I think we've created something truly special here." Earl nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Yes, we have." As he stepped back out into the dining room, he felt a sense of completion he hadn't experienced in years. The restaurant was not only thriving financially but had also become a beacon of dignity and respect, a rare combination in an industry that often prioritized profit over people. Earl's vision had materialized into something tangible, something meaningful. And it wasn't just limited to La Maison. Word of the changes had spread to the other restaurants in the group, and many were beginning to adopt similar practices, realizing that a more inclusive atmosphere didn't detract from their appeal, it enhanced it. But Earl's work was far from over. As the restaurant grew in popularity, it began to attract attention from local media, curious about the man behind the transformation. A journalist from a prestigious magazine requested an interview, eager to understand what had motivated Earl's bold shift in philosophy. Earl agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to share his story and inspire others. The interview took place in the restaurant's private dining room, a cozy, intimate space lined with vintage wine bottles and soft, ambient lighting. The journalist, a young woman with a notepad and recorder, looked at Earl with genuine curiosity. "So, Mr. Martin," she began, her pen poised, "you've taken a very unconventional approach to running a luxury restaurant. What inspired this change?" Earl leaned back, his gaze thoughtful as he recalled his journey. "I've spent my life building wealth, but I remember what it was like to have nothing, to be judged by how I looked rather than who I was. I wanted to create a space where people felt valued for who they are, not for what they can display." The journalist nodded, scribbling notes, her eyes widening with interest. "And have you faced resistance from others in the company?" Earl chuckled softly. "More than a little. Many people didn't believe in this vision at first. They were afraid it would dilute the brand, make us less appealing to our traditional clientele. But the results speak for themselves. People are hungry for authenticity, for a place where they're treated with dignity, regardless of their background." As the interview continued, Earl shared stories of the changes he had implemented, from the staff training programs to the policy of welcoming all patrons with respect. He spoke of the challenges he had faced, the difficult conversations with resistant employees, and the satisfaction of watching those same employees transform as they embraced the new direction. At the end of the interview, the journalist looked at him with admiration. "Thank you, Mr. Martin. I think our readers will be inspired by your story." Earl smiled. "If this story encourages even one person to treat others with more kindness and respect, then it's worth it." The article, published the following week, created a ripple effect. People from all walks of life began flocking to La Maison and its sister restaurants, eager to experience the legendary hospitality firsthand. Other restaurant owners, inspired by Earl's story, began reaching out to him for advice, curious about how they could replicate his success. Earl took these opportunities to advocate for inclusivity, encouraging them to see their businesses not just as profit-making entities, but as spaces that could make a positive impact on people's lives. One afternoon, as Earl was going over some paperwork in his office, he received a call from Richard Wallace. Earl had anticipated that Richard might reach out eventually, as the success of La Maison had become impossible to ignore. The media coverage and the restaurant's booming popularity had forced the upper management to acknowledge the benefits of Earl's approach. "Earl," Richard said, his voice carrying a tone of reluctant respect, "I'll admit, you've proven me wrong. The numbers, the public response, it's all undeniable. I suppose there's something to be said for this inclusive approach of yours." Earl smiled, though there was no triumph in his expression, just a quiet satisfaction. "I'm glad to hear that, Richard. It was never about proving anyone wrong. I just wanted to show that there's a different way to run a business, one that puts people first." There was a pause on the line, then a soft sigh from Richard. "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. The board has decided to extend your policies across the entire group. Consider this our endorsement of your vision." Earl's smile deepened. "Thank you, Richard. I think this is the beginning of something truly impactful." The call ended and Earl leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a rare moment of contentment. His journey, though filled with challenges, had brought him to a place of profound fulfillment. He had not only changed the course of a company but had also shifted an industry standard, demonstrating that inclusivity could be a cornerstone of success, not an obstacle to it. In the following months, the hospitality group flourished, its reputation growing beyond that of just a luxury brand. La Maison and its sister restaurants became known as places where anyone could enjoy a fine dining experience, where the quality of service was matched by the warmth of the welcome. Patrons returned not just for the food but for the feeling of being seen, respected, and valued. Earl, though content with the progress, continued to keep a watchful eye on his establishments. He remained involved, visiting each restaurant periodically, checking in with staff, and ensuring that his vision was being upheld. He knew that true change required vigilance, a commitment to maintaining the values he had worked so hard to instill. One evening, as he dined at La Maison, Earl watched a young hostess welcome an elderly couple who had wandered in off the street. The couple looked around, clearly a bit overwhelmed by the elegant surroundings, but the hostess greeted them with genuine warmth, guiding them to a comfortable table by the window. Earl's heart swelled with pride as he watched the interaction unfold. It was a simple moment, but it encapsulated everything he had fought for: a place where everyone was treated with dignity, where kindness and respect were woven into the fabric of the experience. As he finished his meal and prepared to leave, the new head chef approached his table, a broad smile on her face. "Mr. Martin, I wanted to thank you again. This place, it's become something special because of you. People feel it." Earl returned her smile, his voice soft with gratitude. "It's because of all of you. You've brought this vision to life." He walked out of La Maison that night, feeling a sense of peace that went beyond words. He had created a legacy, not just in terms of wealth but in values, in the way people treated one another. And as he stepped into the cool night air, he knew that he had made a lasting difference, one that would resonate far beyond his lifetime. His journey had come full circle from being the man judged for his appearance to becoming the man who redefined what it meant to be truly wealthy. In the end, Earl Martin had discovered that his greatest investment wasn't in businesses or assets, but in people, in the simple act of kindness and respect that could transform lives. And that, he realized, was the most valuable legacy he could leave behind. Earl Martin walked into La Maison one last time, dressed in the same worn-out coat and faded jeans he had worn on that first visit months ago. The familiar fabric felt comfortable against his skin, like an old friend that had been with him through countless memories. Tonight, however, was different. This was not a test of the staff or a statement of defiance. It was a quiet celebration of the journey that had transformed not only this restaurant but an entire company and perhaps, in a small way, the industry itself. Earl wanted to experience it all one more time, to sit as an anonymous patron in the establishment he had redefined. The hostess, one of the newer employees, fresh-faced and bright-eyed, smiled warmly at him as he approached. She didn't hesitate or falter as her gaze met his close, nor did she glance over her shoulder for validation. Instead, she greeted him with a genuine warmth that he had hoped would become the hallmark of La Maison. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice gentle and welcoming. "Would you like a table for one, or are you expecting someone to join you?" Earl smiled back, nodding. "Just one tonight." She guided him toward a table near the window, where the glow of the city lights cast a soft ambience over the room. Earl took his seat, the view of the city familiar yet somehow magical, a symbol of how far he had come and the legacy he was leaving behind. The hostess handed him a menu, pausing with a gracious smile. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let us know. We're here to make your evening special." "Thank you," Earl replied, his heart warmed by her sincerity. He looked around the restaurant, taking in the scene. The dining room was filled with a diverse array of patrons, each table alive with conversations and laughter. The atmosphere was elegant but unpretentious, a place where families, couples, and friends gathered without fear of judgment or exclusion. This was the heart of his vision made real. A waiter approached his table, greeting him with a respectful nod. Earl recognized him as one of the staff members who had initially resisted the changes, a young man who had once believed that exclusivity was synonymous with quality. But now the waiter's demeanor was transformed, his smile was genuine, his movements fluid and attentive. "Good evening, sir. Can I start you off with something to drink?" the waiter asked, his tone friendly but respectful. "Just water, please," Earl replied. He didn't need the pretense of a high-end wine or cocktail tonight. He wanted to savor the simplicity of the moment, the quiet elegance of being just another guest. As the waiter left, Earl watched him move confidently through the dining room, serving each guest with the same warmth and attention he had shown Earl. It was a subtle but powerful shift, a testament to the journey they had all been on together. The staff had grown into the vision, embracing it as their own, and Earl couldn't help but feel a deep pride watching them embody the values he had worked so hard to instill. The evening unfolded in a rhythm of gentle conversation, exquisite food, and quiet observation. Earl enjoyed each course, savoring the flavors crafted by the new head chef who had taken the reins with passion and integrity. The dishes were a blend of innovation and tradition, reflecting both the chef's creativity and the spirit of inclusivity that now defined La Maison. Every bite was a reminder of the transformation that had taken place not only in the kitchen but in the hearts of everyone involved. As he reached his dessert, a delicate lemon tart with a hint of lavender, Earl noticed an elderly woman entering the restaurant with her granddaughter. They were dressed modestly, the young girl looking around with wide-eyed wonder as she took in the elegant surroundings. Earl watched as the hostess greeted them with the same warmth she had shown him, guiding them to a table near his. The young girl's eyes sparkled with excitement, and the grandmother's face softened with gratitude, clearly touched by the way they were treated. Earl felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him as he watched them. Moments like these had become common at La Maison, yet each one felt uniquely special. This was what he had wanted, a place where people from all walks of life could experience kindness, respect, and beauty. For years, he had built businesses, amassed wealth, and pursued success, but this restaurant, with its unassuming elegance and open doors, felt like his true legacy. As he finished his dessert, the manager approached his table, his face lighting up in recognition as he realized who Earl was. "Mr. Martin," he said, his voice filled with respect, "it's an honor to have you here tonight." Earl smiled, waving off the formalities. "Please, tonight I'm just a guest. Call me Earl." The manager nodded, a grateful smile on his face. "Of course, Earl. I just wanted to thank you. Working here, seeing the impact of your vision, it's been transformative for all of us. The staff, the customers, everyone feels it." Earl nodded, his gaze soft. "Thank you. But it's all of you who've brought this to life. I just set the stage." The manager hesitated, then continued, "I've never worked in a place where the guests feel this comfortable, where the staff takes this much pride in what they do. It's rare." Earl met the manager's gaze, his expression one of quiet understanding. True luxury isn't in the exclusivity of who we serve, it's in the quality of how we serve them. That's what I wanted for La Maison, a place where people feel seen. The manager nodded thoughtfully before excusing himself, leaving Earl to his reflections. Earl sat back, allowing himself a moment to simply enjoy the hum of the dining room, the subtle music, the laughter, and the warmth that seemed to radiate from every corner. The restaurant had become a living embodiment of his values, a place where everyone, from the wealthiest patron to the most modest guest, could feel a sense of belonging. After settling his bill, Earl rose from his table and made his way toward the exit. The hostess wished him a warm good night, her smile sincere as she thanked him for dining with them. Earl nodded, tipping his hat slightly as he stepped out into the cool night air. Standing on the sidewalk, he looked back at the glowing windows of La Maison, the soft lights casting a welcoming glow out into the street. He knew that he had left something behind, something that would live on even in his absence. As he walked down the street, Earl's thoughts drifted to the future. He had accomplished what he had set out to do, creating a space that honored dignity and respect above all else. But there was still more he wanted to give. He had begun to consider ways he could expand his vision even further, perhaps through partnerships or by mentoring others who shared his ideals. He wanted this legacy of kindness and inclusion to ripple beyond La Maison, to inspire change in an industry often driven by status and superficiality. For the first time in years, Earl felt a sense of peace settle over him, as though he had finally found the culmination of his life's work. His wealth, his power, his influence, they were all tools he had wielded to bring about a deeper change, one that mattered far more than any financial success. Earl turned a corner, blending into the city's evening crowds, just another man in a coat and hat. He felt a strange but comforting anonymity, a sense of freedom in being just another face in the crowd. As he walked, he knew that La Maison would continue without him, that the seeds he had planted would keep growing, nurtured by the people who had embraced his vision. In the quiet streets of the city, Earl Martin found himself at peace, knowing he had left something behind that transcended wealth or fame. He had created a place where every person could feel valued, and in doing so, he had crafted a legacy of respect that would endure.